Chapter 4. 2 days later, Dr. Landerson stopped John in the main hallway. "Dr. Gravers wants to meet with you. Do you know where his office is?" "I'm supposed to meet with him today?" John checked the date on his watch. "I thought it was next week. Did I misunderstand?" "Nope, you were right. He planned to be out of town. Directly after the convention, he and Mrs. Gravers were leaving on a short cruise, but at the last minute, she got upset over something, decided she wasn't going. Now he's back. According to Dr. Gravers, that's to be expected of women. He puts up with a lot. Here, follow me. You're free at the moment, right? I'll take you to his office." John followed as they headed toward the west hallway. "There you are," an impatient voice said from behind. John turned to see the long gray goatee strained by the narrow features of the president's face. Dr. Gravers was taller than John remembered. Dr. Landerson stepped towards Dr. Gravers. "Steve, I was just sending him down to your office." "We've got the King family here. We've been in there, waiting for 10 minutes. I thought you wanted Sanders." "Bring him along." Dr. Gravers gave a brief smile. "Good to see you again, Dr. Sanders." His eyes turned away. "Gary, move it along. We're in a rush." In the conference room, a hefty, dark-haired man sat next to a petite woman. "Found him," Dr. Gravers announced. "Dr. Landerson, Roger, and Barbara King." At the announcement of their names, the couple stood. "And their son, Dale." Dr. Gravers addressed another man, a younger replica of the first, who paced the floor. "Here, Dale, why don't you have a seat?" "I'm fine," Dale replied. "Dale, sit down," his father ordered. The pacing continued. "Now." The son obeyed, and the room became stiffly quiet. "Oh, and this is Dr. Sanders," Dr. Gravers said. "I've asked him to sit in on our discussion." Dale stood up. "I want to leave." "You don't have a choice," Mr. King said. "This isn't where I belong." "You agreed to get help," the mother said softly. "Dale," Dr. Gravers said, "if you have a seat, we'd be happy to answer any concerns you might have." "No, not here. I don't belong here." Dr. Gravers waved his hand toward the chair. "I certainly can appreciate your hesitation, but we're here to help." "Listen to the man," Mr. King said to his son. "No, I want him to listen to me." "I'd be happy to listen, Dale," Dr. Gravers said calmly. "But without them in here," Dale pointed to his parents. "They'll tell you lies." "Perhaps now would be a good time for you to talk with Dr. Landerson," Dr. Gravers said. "This would be a chance for you to tell him some of the things you want, why you feel like your parents have brought you here, and how Clearcreek can fill some of your needs." "Where would they be?" Dale asked, pointing again at his parents. "I'll speak with your parents and discuss some of the concerns they might have." Dale stopped pacing. "Who's Landerson?" "I am." Dr. Landerson stood up. "I don't have to be here," Dale said. "That's fine," Dr. Landerson said. "We have a few short tests that will help you and I assess that." "I don't think that's a good idea," Dale said. Mr. King stood up. "Go with him. Now." Mrs. King pulled on her husband's arm until he settled back into the chair. Then she said, "Please, son, we talked about this already. You agreed to see what this place could do for you. You've already accepted the conditions." Dale shoved an empty chair against the table. "Fine. Let's get this over with." Dr. Gravers looked at John. "Why don't you join them?" "No," Dale said. "He's not coming." "That's enough, Dale," Mr. King said. "Stop fighting." "I said no. I'll only talk to one of them at a time." "Don't be difficult." The father's face had turned red. "So it's 2 of them. What's the big deal? Talk to both of them and let's get this over with." "Please, dear," Mrs. King pleaded with her husband. "Let him have some say." "Fine," Mr. King turned to Dr. Gravers. "You'll have to excuse my son." There was an awkward silence. Then Dr. Gravers spoke. "We're here to assist you, Dale. Why don't you follow Dr. Landerson? We'll keep Dr. Sanders here with us." "Good," Dale said, and followed Dr. Landerson from the room. "Dr. Gravers," Mrs. King said, "I hope you understand. He's going through a lot. There have been quite a lot of legal threats." "Barb," Mr. King gave his wife a silencing glance. "It's all right," Dr. Gravers said. "You've brought your son here for a reason, and we want to do everything in our power to make things better for Dale, and for both of you. So please, be open with us." "He's a good kid," Mrs. King said. Mr. King's knuckles tapped against the table's surface. "Of course he's a good kid. But he's had a few problems in school," Mrs. King said. "What kind of problems?" Dr. Gravers asked. Mr. King's knuckle tapping grew louder. "Nothing different from your typical boy." Mrs. King reached over and grasped her husband's hand, muting the steady beating. "I've no doubt your son is a wonderful person," Dr. Gravers said, "but he does need some help. Tell me when you first noticed your son's symptoms." Mr. King's voice was tense. "Symptoms?" "It was when he told us about the voices." "Barb," Mr. King said under his breath, "this was a mistake." "Mrs. King," Dr. Gravers said, "what were those voices telling him?" "Well, that he..." Mrs. King paused. "That he would be... that there would be..." "You might as well just say it, Barb." "They told him he'd been promised an angel." "Why an angel?" John asked. "I don't know," Mr. King said loudly. "That's what Dale calls it," Mrs. King explained. "He says he's been looking for his angel." Mr. King's words were tight. "It's a girl, that's all it means." "He lacks skills," Mrs. King said. "Girls are afraid of him. He's had a lot of problems." "Can you give me an example?" Dr. Gravers asked. "Well, growing up," Mrs. King said, "he wanted a girl to notice him. He did a few things he shouldn't have." "Mrs. King, tell me some of the things he did. I need you to share details so I can try and understand Dale." "No, Dale would have been fine," Mr. King said. "Let's talk about the kids at his school. Nothing Dale did was a big deal until the jocks at his school got involved. That's when things got worse." "Mr. King, when did Dale begin to hear voices?" "I don't know. He's always been a little odd. That's just who he is." Mrs. King pulled out a white handkerchief and blew her nose. "We learned about them when he was 13, but we ignored it." "When did you become concerned?" Dr. Gravers asked. Mrs. King whispered, "When he attacked a girl in the park." "No!" Mr. King looked directly at Dr. Gravers. "Everyone wants to blame Dale, but it wasn't his fault. Besides, we took care of everything with that one. She's not the problem. It was the next one. That's where the accusations have come from. The trial, the charges, all of it. She did this to us. It's those young girls hungry for a lawsuit, using their vulnerability to lie, to deceive, to trick." "Roger, please." Mrs. King touched her husband's arm. "Let's not go over this again." He heaved a long breath. "It's not his fault." "Roger, when the judge told us we needed to take action to stop him from hurting others, we both agreed he needed help. The psychologist explained the benefits of bringing him here. Now he's here, so everything's going to work out." She stroked her husband's large forearm. "Stop worrying." "Did the psychologist recommend Clearcreek?" Dr. Gravers asked. "Not exactly," she said. "I don't know if you know this, but my brother was once a resident at this hospital." "Is that right? When was he here?" 30 years ago. Dr. Crandall was the president then." "Yes, that was my grandfather." Dr. Gravers smiled. "We know," Mr. King said. "When we set up the appointment, we learned about the connection. Dr. Crandall was remarkable. My parents are very grateful for all his assistance. How's your brother doing? Good. Barb, we go out of our way to avoid him. He is doing good. He never had to come back. That's our goal. Dr. Gravers cleared his throat. This is an exceptional facility. Due to my grandfather's hard work and the continued efforts of myself and other past presidents, Clearcreek is now one of the most respected private institutions in the West. That's why we brought him here, Mrs. King said. Over the next 10 minutes, John marveled at the craft of Dr. Gravers. He carried a soothing demeanor as he spoke of Clearcreek's waiting list, but assured the Kings he'd be able to make the necessary arrangements for Dale. When tension rose again over how long Dale would need to stay, Dr. Gravers mitigated Mr. King's concerns with confident talk of Clearcreek's capabilities, success stories, and the sister facilities in place that helped with the transition back into society. But before we can accurately assess long-term needs, his tone still appeased the concerned parents. We need to address your immediate concerns. Then he shared Clearcreek's strengths, highlighting the staff and the state-of-the-art facility. His long fingers tapped a glossy marketing folder, the cover modeled with a picture of Clearcreek's building and landscape. He kept his voice smooth as he flipped through the folder, discussing Clearcreek's offerings, payment options, and again Clearcreek's successes. Although Gravers glided over payment options, the mere mention of it restored the tension in the room. So how much is this going to cost? Mr. King reached for the packet. If our insurance won't cover any of his care, Mrs. King looked close to tears. After hiring the lawyer, paying Dale's fine and bail, and the psychologist fees, I don't know if we can afford it right now. We work with you here. The president's tone held such an assurance as if the Kings had nothing to fear. It's a true pity what insurance companies have done. About 7 years ago, when I saw the future of insurance companies and their altered coverage, I kept fighting. I stayed committed because I knew there was a need for this type of facility, where a fine family like yours could find superior care for that special person you love so deeply. Once we have Dr. Lenderson's assessment, we can run through the various options and find the right path for your family. Gravers' confidence continued as he shared his own successes, citing his efforts in obtaining grants, research money, and donations, so that remarkable deductions had been made, bringing typical in-house patient care to an affordable level. While the tension in the room subsided once again, Gravers pointed at the folder, now resting between Mr. and Mrs. King. State facilities can't give the devoted care we can. Instead, their residents are the ones who get hurt by this, because they wind up returning back to hospitalization over and over again. But with the prime care and individual help we offer, you'll see. He glanced at the folder's image of Clearcreek and paused to smile. We have what your son needs. When he looked back at the Kings, they shared a calmer smile too. Trust me. His voice served as a warm blanket, tucking the Kings in. You've brought Dale to the right place.